Okay, we are on the third part of the book. René Girard, I see Satan fall like lightning. If you've read this far, thanks for joining me. I am putting the playlists in the comments or in the description of these videos now because I have a playlist, but it's not so easy to find if you're searching on your phone, if you're searching YouTube on your phone. So part 3, we'll just get right into it here. Quick overview. The first part of the book was the biblical knowledge of violence. Second part 2, was the enigma of myth resolve. And part 3, which has 5 chapters, is entitled The Victory of the Cross. So we see a progression here. The chapters in part 3 are the uniqueness of the Bible, the uniqueness of the Gospels, the triumph of the cross, scapegoat, the modern concern for victims, and the twofold Nietzschean heritage. And then there's a conclusion and an index. So chapter 9 is the uniqueness of the Bible, and we'll just get right into it here. Unlike the old modern critics, postmodern opponents of Christianity don't try to demonstrate that the Gospels and myths are similar, identical, or interchangeable. Differences don't trouble them, and in fact, they pile up differences with ease. It is rather the resemblance that they suppress. If there are only differences between the religions, they make up just one big undifferentiated conglomerate. We can no more say they are true or false than we could say a story by Flaubert or by Maupassant is true or false. To regard one of these works of fiction as more true or false than the other would be absurd. The doctrine of insignificant differences has seduced the contemporary world. Differences are the objects of a veneration more apparent than real. Those who discuss religions have the impression of taking them very seriously, but in reality they don't attach the least importance to them. They view all the religions, as completely mythical, but each in its own fashion. They praise them all in the same spirit. They praise them all in the same spirit. We all praise kindergartners' paintings, which are all masterpieces. The upshot of this attitude is that we are all free to buy what pleases us in the supermarket of religions, or better still, to abstain from buying anything. The old Christian anthropologists knew better. Like Christians themselves, they believed in truth. To demonstrate the Gospels were meaningless, they tried to show that they resembled myths too closely not to be mythical as well. They did, therefore, just what I have done. They sought to define what the myths and the Gospels have in common. They hoped that the two had so much in common that no room would be left for any significant difference between them. In this way, they tried to demonstrate the mythic character of the latter. These industrious researchers never discovered what they were looking for, but in my view, they were right to persist in their search. The reality common to foundational myths and the Gospels does exist, as I have shown, the Memetic or satanic cycle. This is the 3-part sequence of the initial crisis, the ensuing collective violence, and finally the religious epiphany, that revelation streaming from the single victim mechanism. Paradoxically, their anti-Christian perspective prevented the old anthropologists from discovering all the similarities between the Gospels and the myths. Fearing, no doubt, that they might fall again into the orbit of the Gospels, they kept their distance from them. They would have considered themselves disgraced if they had utilized them as I have done in the first 3 chapters of this book. The Gospels are more transparent than myths, and they make everything clear around them, for they are explicit on the subject of memetic contagion, which begins in rivalry and conflict and then becomes reconciliatory. As they reveal the memetic process, they shed light on the obscurity of myths. If we had done the reverse and based our investigations on myths, we would learn nothing about the Gospels. After discovering the memetic cycle thanks to the Gospels, we detected it again without difficulty, first in the stoning instigated by Apollonius and then in all mythic cults. From then on, we knew that what makes primitive cultures functioning is basically the regulation of the memetic cycle through single victim mechanisms and their ritual repetitions. The old anthropologists followed the opposite method. They believed they were obliged to find support in myths in order to attack the Gospels. They would have thought they were betraying their own cause if they had moved the other way from the Gospels to myths. Myths display the same mimetic process as the Gospels, of course, but usually in such an obscure and confused way that if we use them as our base and point of departure, we cannot succeed in dispelling the, quote, darkness of Satan, unquote. My point of departure from the Gospels is not in order to arbitrarily to favor Christianity and reject paganism. The discovery of the mimetic cycle in myths does not at all confirm the old Christian belief in the absolute uniqueness of Christianity and seems initially to make it more improbable and indefensible than ever. The Gospels and myths recount the same type of mimetic crisis, which is resolved by the same type of collective expulsion and concluded by an epiphany or revelation that is repeated and commemorated by rituals similar in structure. So what distinguishes mythology and Christianity in a way that confers on the latter the uniqueness it has always claimed? In Christianity, of course, the sacrifices offered are not animals or humans. There is no longer an actual blood sacrifice. We see everywhere in Christianity the non-violence that we observed in chapter 4, where we compared the stoning Apollonius instigated and the stoning that Christ prevented. The real Christian, however, is not content with this difference. Christianity could still appear to be an attenuated mimetic process, softened but essentially unchanged. The attenuation and mellowing appear also in a number of later mythic cults. For the moment, we can't see at the level of the original mythic structure what might distinguish the Gospels from myth other than in a superficial, insignificant fashion. This result would have gladdened the old anti-Christian anthropologists. For centuries, the familiar feeling that Christianity is irreducibly unique was getting weaker among many Christians, and comparative anthropological studies holding to the mythic view of Christianity contributed to this weakening. This is, by the way, why some faithful Christians mistrust my work. They are convinced that nothing good for Christianity can come out of comparative anthropology. The question is so important that I am going to briefly repeat the point. When we compare a sacred revelation that the Gospels regard as false, mythical, satanic, to the sacred revelation that they regard as true, we can see no significant discrepancy. In both cases, we are dealing with mimetic cycles, all of which end with scapegoats and resurrections. So what allows Christianity to define pagan religions as satanic or diabolic, but to exclude itself from this definition? I intend for this study to be as objective as quote-unquote scientific as possible. So as you can see, I am not proposing that the gospel oppositions between God and Satan be blindly accepted. If I cannot show modern readers what makes this a real, concrete opposition, they will understandably reject it as deceptive and illusory. So for right now, the two appear to be equivalent, certainly in terms of structure. The mimetic cycles that produce the mythic deities and the mimetic cycle that leads to the resurrection of Jesus and the affirmation of his divinity. In short, the distinction between God and Satan may be an illusion produced by the desire of Christians to view their religion as unique and to proclaim themselves as the sole adherents of a truth that is alien to mythology. Not only non-Christians, but also many Christians aware of resemblances between the Gospels and the myths deny the Christian claim of uniqueness today. The mimetic cycle in the Gospels contains the three phases of the mythic cycle: crisis, collective violence, and sacred revelation. Nothing objectively distinguishes it from a myth. It is not merely one more myth of death and resurrection, a little more refined perhaps than many others, but fundamentally similar. Rather than dealing with this problem directly, I will divide it into two parts. In doing so, I will draw upon the book to which true Christians are devoted as to the New Testament, the book they call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. For tactical reasons that will become evident as we go, I will begin with the Old Testament, and this apparent detour will lead me into the heart of my subject. The theme common to both myth and gospel is the mimetic cycle, and it is found only partially in the Old Testament accounts. The mimetic crisis and collective violence are there, but the third phase of the mimetic cycle is absent, the sacred revelation, the resurrection that reveals the divinity of the victim. To repeat, only the first two phases are present in the Hebrew Bible. It is quite evident in these texts that the victims never rise again. God is never victimized, nor is the victim divinized. Thus, between the Hebrew Bible and the myths, there is this difference, one extremely significant for the problem that occupies us. In the biblical monotheism, we cannot suspect God of being the product of the scapegoat process that quite visibly produced the gods in primitive polytheism. Now we will compare a great biblical account, the story of Joseph, to the most well-known myth of all, the story of King Oedipus. The results will facilitate our access to the essential problem, the divinity of Jesus Christ in the Christian religion. Let's verify at the outset that the first two phases of the memetic cycle, the crisis and the collective violence, do occur in both our texts. The myth and the biblical account both commence with the childhood of the two heroes. In both cases, the first part narrates a crisis within two families, which is resolved by the violent expulsion of the two heroes while they are yet children. Oedipus is still a baby. In the myth, an oracle precipitates the crisis between the parents and their newborn son. The divine voice announces that Oedipus will someday kill his father and marry his mother. Seized with fright, Laius and Jocasta decide to slay their own son. Oedipus barely escapes death but is expelled from his own family. In the biblical story, the jealousy of the 10 brothers precipitates the crisis. The point of departure is different, but the result is the same. The 10 want to kill Joseph, but finally they sell him as a slave to a caravan heading for Egypt. Just like Oedipus, in short, Joseph barely escapes death and is expelled from his own family. In the parallel beginnings, as we recognize what we expected to find, a memetic crisis and a single victim mechanism, in both instances, a community gathers unanimously against one of its members and violently expels him. In the course of the two stories, there is a second crisis, which is followed by a second expulsion in the case of Oedipus. Oedipus escapes the claws of the Sphinx by resolving her enigma, and in solving the puzzle, he also saves the entire city. The city of Thebes rewards him by making him its king. But the victory is not final. Some years later, unknown to all, including the hero, the predictions of the oracle come to pass. Oedipus killed his father and married his mother. To prevent the Thebans from sheltering in their midst a son who is both parasital and incestuous, Apollo strikes them with a plague that compels them to expel Oedipus a second time. Let us return to Joseph. To extricate himself from his predicament in Egypt, this hero makes good use of the same kind of talent as Oedipus, the deciphering of riddles. He interprets dreams, those of 2 royal officials initially, then Pharaoh's himself, the famous dream of the 7 fat cows and the 7 lean cows. His gift of clairvoyance gets our hero released from prison, imprisonment amounted to an expulsion, and protects Egypt from the consequences of the famine. Pharaoh raises Joseph to the rank of prime minister. His wonderful talent propels him to the top of the social ladder, exactly like Oedipus. Because of the initial expulsions, Oedipus and Joseph both have to become forgiven foreigners and are thus always a little suspect in the principal place where they perform their exploits. Thebes for Oedipus, Egypt for Joseph. The careers of these two heroes follow an alternating course of brilliant achievements and violent expulsions. Consequently, between the myth and the biblical story, the numerous and essential similarities confirm our previous finding. We always find the memetic process of crisis and violent expulsion in mythical as well as biblical texts. The myth and the biblical account are much closer to one another and resemble each other much more than the most readers suspect. Is this to say that they agree on everything essential? Can we view them as more or less equivalent? Completely to the contrary, locating the common data allows us to take a note of an irreducible difference, an impassable gulf, the biblical story and the myth, between the biblical story and the myth. The myth and the biblical story are in basic opposition over the decisive question that collective violence poses. Is it warranted? Is it legitimate? In the myth, the expulsions of the hero are justified each time. In the biblical account, they never are. Collective violence is unjustifiable. Laius and Jocasta have good reason to rid themselves of a son who, at some point in the future, will kill the one and marry the other. The Thebans also have a good reason to rid themselves of their king. Oedipus really committed the infamous acts the oracle prophesied, and to top it all off, he gave the plague to the whole city. In the myth, the victim is always wrong, and his persecutors are always right. The reverse is true in the Bible. Joseph is in the right against his brothers, as well as the next 2 times against the Egyptians who imprison him. He is in the right against the wanton wife who accused him of trying to rape her. Potiphar, Joseph's master, treats his young slave as though he's really his son, and so the accusation raised against Joseph recalls the accusation of incest made against Oedipus. There we see one more element the two accounts have in common, but as in all the other instances, the structural similarity is the basis of a radical difference from the standpoint of the narrative's identification with the victim. The mythic perspectives and the modern theories that prolong them, psychoanalysis for example, take the mythic accusation for legitimate. In our eyes, everyone is more or less guilty of patricide and incest, if only at the level of desire. The biblical story refuses to take this kind of accusation seriously. It recognizes it in the typical obsession of hysterical crowds against those whom they make their victims for the least thing. Not only did Joseph not have sex with the wife of Potiphar, but he did everything he could to resist her advances. She is the guilty one. And behind her, the Egyptian crowd, like dumb cattle following the herd in the expulsions of young immigrants who are isolated and without means or political pull. The relation of the two heroes to the two scourges that strike their adopted countries repeats and recapitulates both the multiple convergences of the two texts and, above all, the single divergence that is absolutely decisive. Oedipus is responsible for the plague and can do nothing to heal it, in short of his own expulsion. But Joseph is not responsible for famine. Moreover, he manages the crisis so ably that he protects Egypt from disaster that could have occurred. The same question underlies both narratives. Does the hero deserve to be expelled? The myth answers at every point yes, and the Bible answers no, no, and no. The career of Oedipus ends in an expulsion whose finality confirms his guilt. Joseph's career ends in a triumph whose finality confirms his innocence. The fundamental nature of the contrast between the myth and the biblical account suggests that the latter is the expression of an anti-mythological inspiration. And this inspiration discloses something essential in the myths that would remain invisible outside of the perspective of the biblical narratives, what they represent. The myth always condemn all victims who are isolated and overwhelmed. They are the work of agitated crowds that are incapable of identifying and criticizing their own tendency to expel and murder those who cannot defend themselves. Scapegoats that they always take for guilty of the same stereotypical crimes: parricide, incest, bestial fornication, and other horrible misdeeds whose perpetual and improbable reoccurrence point up their absurdity. In the episode that follows, a moment of reckoning occurs between Joseph and his brothers, one that is peaceful in keeping with Joseph's affirmation of God's providential intentions for Israel and Egypt. The story of Joseph continues beyond this episode, but it is the real conclusion of the main plot of Joseph sold by his brothers and expelled by his own family that concerns us here. It confirms in unequivocal fashion, as we shall see, the biblical opposition to mythic collective violence. The 7 years of lean cows have begun, and the 10 half-brothers of Joseph suffer because of the famine in Canaan. So they travel to Egypt to beg for food. They don't recognize Joseph as a prime minister in his beautiful garments, but Joseph recognizes them. Without making himself known, he inquires discreetly about Benjamin, their younger brother, who they left at home for fear that some misfortune would happen to him, and their old father, Jacob, would die of grief. Joseph gives wheat to all his half-brothers. He warns them, however, that if they come back because of the famine, they must bring Benjamin or they will get nothing. The famine continues on, so the 10 finally return to Egypt. This time they have Benjamin with them. Joseph allows them to buy wheat, but he also has a servant conceal a precious cup of Benjamin's sack. Complaining that someone stole this article from him, Joseph has their bags searched. When the cup is found, he announces the arrest of the allegedly guilty brother, Benjamin, and he authorizes the 10 older brothers to return home peacefully. In short, Joseph submits his guilty brothers to a temptation they know well, since they have already succumbed to it, that of abandoning with impunity their youngest brother, the weakest and most vulnerable among them. 9 of the brothers fall a second time to this temptation. Only Judah resists it and offers himself in the place of Benjamin. In recompense for Judah's willingness to replace Benjamin, Joseph weeps and pardons all his brothers. In his adopted country, he welcomes and receives his entire family, including his old father, Jacob. This final episode in a meditation on a kind of collective violence with which the biblical story is obsessed just as much as myths, but the results are the reverse. The final triumph of Joseph is not an insignificant happy ending, but a means of making explicit the problem of violent expulsions. Without ever leaving its narrative framework, the biblical account pursues a reflection on violence whose radicalism is revealed at the point where pardon replaces the obligatory vengeance. It is only this pardon, this forgiveness, that is capable of stopping once and for all the spiral of reprisals, which of course are sometimes interrupted by unanimous expulsions, but violently and only temporarily. The biblical account accuses the 10 brothers of hating Joseph for no good reason, and of envying him because of his intrinsic superiority, and their fathers Jacob doting on him. The real cause of the expulsion is memetic rivalry. Could anyone accuse me of slanting my analysis in favor of my position and of the biblical story? I believe not. If the myth and the biblical account were both fictional works, the production of fantasy stories in the same sense of postmodern criticism, their disagreement about the guilt or innocence of the two victims, Oedipus and Joseph, might not mean anything at all. The differences might well have their roots in the individual caprice of the two authors and the preference of the one for stories that have an unhappy ending, and for the other for stories that have a happy ending. All texts are comparable to the forever changing Proteus. Postmodern critiques repeat unceasingly, so the interpreter cannot reduce them to one constant theme. Always happy to kill off any meaning, our deconstructors and other postmodern intellectuals will certainly not want to grant that the myths in the biblical texts embody two opposing positions on the question of collective violence. My response to the objection is that the biblical narrative's refusal to accept the expulsion of Joseph cannot be accidental. It could not be that a deliberate critique of the mythic attitude, not only because of the last episode of that Joseph story, but also because this story is narrated in the context of all the data that are common to mythic and biblical texts. It is these data that I analyzed at length in the previous chapters before finding them again in our two stories. We find there a web of correspondence too tight to be accidental. The multiple similarities guarantee the significance of the single but decisive difference, a thoroughgoing refusal of mythic expulsions. This is what the biblical account teaches us. The comparison of the myth and the story of Joseph shows that the biblical author probably intended to criticize, not the myth of Oedipus specifically, but one of or several unidentifiable myths that must have been similar to the Oedipus myth. The biblical story condemns the general tendency of myth to justify collective violence, which is part and parcel of the accusatory, vindictive nature of foundational myths. We must not think of the relation between myth and the Bible in terms of the sole difference in perspective on victims and executioners, nor must we think of this relation in terms of similarities only. To arrive at the true meaning, we must focus on the difference in the context of all similarities. In myths, as in the biblical text, the expulsions of individuals and adjudged to be evildoers play a huge role. Both myth and biblical texts agree on this point, but the myths are incapable of criticizing this role. They cannot question themselves about collective expulsion as such. The biblical account, on the other hand, attains this level of questioning and resolutely affirms the injustice of collective expulsion. So the discovery of all the features common to the myth of Oedipus and the story of Joseph, the presence of the memetic cycle in such texts, does not at all demonstrate the equivalence of these two texts. It allows us rather to dismiss the trifling and useless differences of contemporary postmodern differentialism, which can do nothing but multiply differences that lead further and further into absurdity. In avoiding this obsession with difference, we can concentrate on the essential divergences of what has to be called biblical truth from the lie of mythology. The truth transcends the question of referentiality in the biblical account. That is, does it refer to real events outside the story or not? The essential truth of Joseph's story lies not in its possible correspondence to facts outside the text, but in its critique of mythic expulsions. This critique is absolutely relevant given that these expulsions always have their source in memetic contagion and thus are not the fruit of rational, impartial judgment. So I'll stop there, about 25 minutes in. So I'm going to make this a two-part video series on this Chapter 9. Thanks for listening.